Imagine you find yourself in the 1st century of the Common Era. You are a Roman citizen, and you are writing a history of the late Republic, which has recently morphed into something else under the guidance of the Julio-Claudian family. Your city, Rome, can claim sole ownership of the entire Mediterranean, and its political life is stabilizing after the terror of the civil wars which turned Romans against Romans from most of the previous century. You find yourself returning to the Eternal City, having made a visit to Capua, and are following the Via Appia north to the Servian walls and the Porta Capena, which will deliver you back into the city proper. Before reaching the gate, you make a stop at a site near where the road connects with the Via Latina that should help you shed some light on the events that led to the political breakdowns that had caused so much bloodshed and horror in that century of instability. You see in front of you a slightly sloping set of steps leading up to a rounded doorway in the side of a hill. No, you are not visiting a hobbit burrow, but instead a tomb built to house the lineage of the man whose sarcophagus holds the place of honor inside. Before arriving at this place, you passed many sites on this road that share connections to this family, from the villa of Publius Clodius Poker, who was married to Fulvia, a descendant of the Gracchan branch of this family, to the rounded tower that houses a tomb for Caecilia Metella, wife of Marcus Licinius Crassus, son of the triumvir Marcus Licinius Crassus, and brother of Publius, whose wife Cornelia Metella was descended from the Nasican branch of this family. The road that you took here, the Via Appia, was built by the act of, and also named after, Appius Clodius Caecus, whom the founder of this familial line served with and was a political contemporary of. Entering the tomb, you see opposite the door a large sarcophagus with an inscription on the side of it, noting its dedication to Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus, and you are aware that you have crossed into the world of the Cornelii Scipiones, the masters of war, who in some way, shape, or form will have connections to the largest and most important events of the late Republican period. Welcome to the Cursus Scipionum, where we will attempt to tell the story of Republican Rome through the eyes of this exceptional family. Now, this is where a fancy animated video with dramatic theme music would play over like some sort of a moving map as the name of the show gets chiseled into place. That is, if this were a serious documentary, of course. Okay, so where were we? Oh, right. We were looking at Barbatus' sarcophagus and its epitaph. Taking a close look at the writing, we would find a line above the inscription that had been chiseled out by hammers, which is how you hit backspace in the ancient world. The remaining text would read, Cornelius Lucius Scipio Barbatus, offspring of his father Gnaeus, a brave man and wise, whose appearance was a match for his virtus. He was consul and censor and aedile among you. He took Teresia and Cassana from Samnium. He subdued the whole of Lucania and took hostages. Wow, what a resume. Barbatus seems to have had a lot going on. He seems to have had some good qualities, was a political leader, and was potentially a one-man wrecking crew against Rome's enemies. The only thing we don't know from this is when he lived, which from sources we can be fairly certain was between 338 and 270 BCE. Taking in all this information, we find a lot of what we will need to better understand the world of the Romans. First off, we have that name. Cornelius Lucius Scipio Barbatus is a pretty standard Roman name. Almost all Romans have 3 names, and following Latin ordering, they were a tribal name, a first name, a family name, and if we're lucky, a nickname. And trust me, nicknames are going to make it a lot easier to follow along, since Romans only had a handful of names to pick from. Like a limited vocabulary Mad Libs, you will end up seeing some pretty repetitive names. And we have already in Marcus Licinius Crassus being the son of Marcus Licinius Crassus, who was part of the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus. There wasn't a designation for junior in Latin, so you have to pay attention to other contextual clues like the year when reading Roman sources to identify who is being talked about. Also, Roman women, when mentioned at all, are generally only given one name that they are known by, which is a different kind of headache when they share the same name, which, of course, they will. When we have a person with a nickname, I will refer to the person by their nickname to hopefully make things easier to follow. Besides, mononyms are just awesome. Give me an
Aaliyah, Beyonce, Capadonna, Drake, Eminem, Future, GZA, Ice-T, Jay-Z, Kesha, Ludacris, Madonna, Nas, Oprah, Prince, Quavo, RZA, Sade, Seal, Sting, Thundercat, Usher, Voltaire, will.i.am, Exhibit, Yanni, or Zendaya.
Any day of the week. All right, back to Barbatus' name. From his inscription, we know that he was part of the Cornelii tribe, one of the 35 tribes that made up the Roman society. There were 4 urban tribes from the city of Rome and 31 rural tribes from immediately around it. His first name is Lucius, and his family name, or subset of the tribe he belonged to, is the Scipioni. He also has a nickname, Barbatus, meaning bearded or long beard, which went against the norm of his age, as barbers had begun setting up shop in Rome by that time. Incidentally, an adopted descendant of his, Scipio Aemilianus, will start the trend of being clean-shaven in a few generations, which will then continue for about 300 years. Talk about being ahead of your time. And that's what the Scipios were, leaders. Next up from his epitaph, we learn that Barbatus was the offspring of his father Gnaeus, a brave man and wise whose appearance was a match for his Virtus. Talk about a Tinder profile. Barbatus is here to let you know all his shining qualities up front, minus those tacky fish pics. Swipe right on this guy. One of those words, Virtus, stands out and is part of the social norms of Roman life, or Mos Maiorum, that were Romans' conception of what made an ideal person. Mos Maiorum can be translated as ancestral custom or way of the ancestors, and living up to the standards of your family was very important. In Roman society, family was everything, and it was a hierarchical system which mirrored in micro how their society as a whole operated. In this patrilineal society, the oldest man would serve as the paterfamilias for his family. And in this role, he had absolute authority over the decisions of the members of his family. In exercising his power on behalf of the family, he was expected to be moderate and responsible in making decisions, which is kind of like how Michael Corleone is as the head of the family in The Godfather. This mirrored, of course, the patronage system of Roman society, where men of higher social standing would enter into mutual obligations with men of lower social standing to accomplish goals that would improve both of their standings in society. Patrons could, in turn, be clients of higher status men, and clients could have more than one patron. These were not legal contracts, but moral agreements, and they would create these social networks of association. Real my word is my bond kind of stuff here, and again, this is kind of like how the Corleone family works in The Godfather, minus all the crimes. Actually, you know what? Forget about it. This is probably a good time to point out how dualistic Roman society was. Every Roman yin had a Roman yang. They were patrons and clients, patricians or plebeians, optimates or populares. They engaged in war and very rarely peace, and consuls always served in pairs, as a rebellion against one person exercising power following the expulsion of the kings of Rome. There is very little room for middle ground in their society, and anytime 3 or more things show up, like, a triumvirate, or the concept of having rights as a Roman, a Latin, or an ally, or even a plucky religion featuring a Father, a Son, and a Holy Ghost, things go left pretty quickly. Backtracking to Mos Maiorum, let's look at what those ancestral customs were. Romans believed an ideal person had fides, which meant showing trust, good faith, confidence, and reliability in your character; pietas, which meant showing a dutiful respect towards the gods, your patria or country, and your familia; religio, which was the bond between gods and mortals, shown through religious practices; cultus, which was the observance and correct performance of rituals and religious practices; disciplina, which meant having an education and discipline and training; gravitas, meaning having self-control, not being wanton in one's actions; constantia, being steadfast and showing perseverance. A good Roman is always stoic in the face of adversity; virtus, which is the ideal of a true Roman male, knowing what actions are good, evil, useless, shameful, and dishonorable; auctoritas, having prestige and respect; and dignitas, which is having a reputation for worth, honor, and esteem. Of these, dignitas is the most important, as it is based on one's display of the other values like having gravitas, showing constantia, fides, pietas, and so on. And honestly, these values are not that different from what we expect an ideal person to have today. Some, like religio and cultus, have fallen by the wayside, and others, like virtus, have become less gender-specific, but they are essentially what we believe makes a good person today. We find another Scipio epitaph from the same tomb that sums up dignitas as, "I produced offspring, I sought to equal the deeds of my father. I won the praise of my ancestors so that they were glad that I was born to them. My career has ennobled my family line." One caveat of this epitaph is that it doesn't make any mention of specific achievements, so this means one of two things. One, either this is the most humble person ever, or they weren't the most outstanding member of their family. And honestly, while that's all right by our modern standards, the Romans who we meet in history books would not have been cool with that. You either went big or you went home. Speaking of achievements, next up on Barbatus' epitaph are his achievements as a politician. This man was a leader, in more ways than one too, as his epitaph contains the first use of the word consul, spelled here with 2 O's, as well as the first reliable record of someone holding the office of censor. So, what are these offices exactly? The ordering on his epitaph follows the importance of the offices on the Cursus Honorum, the ladder of offices or path of honors, which was the sequential ordering of public offices that could be held by aspiring politicians of the patrician class, and was eventually opened to plebeians as well. And there's that word patrician again. Who are they, and why are they paired against people who are from the plebeian class? Patricians were a class of people within Roman society, and the only thing that made someone a patrician was their ability to trace their family's lineage back to when Romulus, one of the 2 founders of Rome, appointed members of the tribes to be senators. Everyone who could not do that was considered part of the plebeian class, regardless of being rich or poor, owning land, or being homeless. The Scipio family was part of the patrician class, but they were still obsessed with tracing their lineage back as far as possible. They would have been proud members of Ancestry.com, and had it been available, would have salivated over 23andMe testing. The chiseled-out inscription on Barbatus' epitaph is thought to be an attempt to remove him as the founder of the familial line, since a Publius Cornelius Meliginensis Scipio served as consul in 395, and another Lucius Cornelius Scipio was a consul in 350. Being consul was considered the greatest success a politician could have in Roman society. It meant that you had achieved the highest possible office and had a year named after you. Romans didn't go in for using numbers to define years for a very, very long time, so everything is in the year of so-and-so and so-and-so. Imagine defining your birth as, in the 6th year of Ronald Reagan and George Herman Walker Bush. Come on, just no, we're not doing that. In the Republican era, prior to entering the Cursus Honorum, young patrician men were expected to serve for 10 years in the military, where they would act as a military tribune and would be eligible to lead sections of legions. There were 24 of these posts, and they were elected each year. The first official post of the Cursus Honorum was quaestor, which was open to candidates who were at least 30 years old. Quaestors served as financial administrators for both Rome and the legions, and as tax collectors to provincial governors. There were 20 of them, and they were also elected every year. The second post was aedile. This was open to candidates who were at least 36, and aediles were responsible for administrative issues within Rome. Things like taking care of the temples, the organization of public games, the maintenance of public buildings, procuring water and food supplies, and they served as judges in merchant disputes. There were 4 of them, 2 of whom were reserved. 2 spots were reserved for patricians. They were known as curile aediles, and 2 were reserved for plebeians. The third post was praetor. This was open to candidates who were at least 39 years old and who had served as quaestors and aediles. Praetors served as judges in criminal trials and could command armed garrisons in the absence of consuls. They were escorted by 6 lictors, who were official attendants that carried the fasces, a bundle of sticks tied around an axe, and they served as both a weapon and a symbol of the office. Praetors also held imperium, which is a legal form of absolute authority. After achieving praetor rank, one could become a provincial governor, a propraetor, and command provincial legions and hold imperium within their province, which was often abused to enrich themselves. 6 to 8 men were selected to this post each year. The fourth post was consul. This was open to candidates who were at least 42 years old. This was the highest office available to politicians, and the greatest honor was to be elected in one's year, at the age of 42, which famed orator Cicero achieved as a novus homo, or a self-made man, being someone who was of a plebeian background who had been elected to office. This was made possible after the conflict of the orders replaced the idea of governing based on birth with one defined by merit instead. Consuls were responsible for the political agenda of Rome. They commanded legions in battle, they controlled important provinces like Egypt, and were able to veto decisions made by the other. Years were named after the pair of consuls elected, and initially there was a limit placed on their service in the role, being allowed a 1-year term of office and having to wait 10 years before standing for re-election. They were escorted by 12 lictors. They held imperium and they wore the toga praetexta, which is a white toga with a purple border. Their only legal limit in their role was the position of the tribune of the plebs, who they could not veto and in turn could be vetoed by. After their consulship, they served as governors and were assigned to a province. Governors were chained to the 12 lictors of the office and could only be vetoed by another consul or a praetor. The last post on the Cursus Honorum was censor. This was open to former consuls. Censors were elected every 5 years, and they served for 18 months in their role. They were responsible for taking the census, dividing citizens into voting classes, leasing conquered land for public use and sale, and tendering projects for public buildings and games that were financed by the state. They had no lictors, but they did get to wear the toga praetexta. The final post of note was the position of the tribune of the plebs, which was only open to plebeians, and was not part of the Cursus Honorum. It was created to protect the rights of common Romans, and holders of the office were legally protected from harm, being considered sacrosanct while in the position. Their powers included the right to veto any act or proposal, including those of consuls and other tribunes. They could rescue any plebeian from the law, and they could exercise capital punishment against anyone interfering in their duties. They were expected to be available to visitors 24 hours a day, and they were not permitted to travel more than 1 day's journey from Rome. Other positions of political power existed in Roman society, but they were not part of the Cursus Honorum, and often existed only in emergency scenarios, and this was the ideal for how political life was supposed to operate. But over time, as we will see later, things changed and limits were decreased or dropped altogether. Looking again at his epitaph, Barbatus did very well for himself, being elected aedile and then consul in 298, and then serving as censor in 280. We now have an idea of how individuals' names were constructed, how their families and societies were ordered, and the values they believed in, and we have a sense of how the political posts work. And we're only halfway through Barbatus's epitaph, so what's left to talk about? Why, his military feats. The Republic was not a time period that knew much peace. Roman society at the time was hyper-militaristic and geared towards expanding Roman territory as much as possible, which goes hand in hand with their values of virtus, pietas, and dignitas, and the us versus them duality that made up Rome's foreign policy. From his epitaph, we get the sense that Barbatus was a good fighter, achieving victories over neighboring towns and subduing an entire neighboring nation. But the historical record would differ at times. The main source we have for Barbatus's achievements is Titus Livius's Ad Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city, which was written during Augustus's reign. Livy's main source for the work was Quintus Fabius Pictor, who wrote in the 2nd century BCE, and is recognized as the first Roman historian. He wrote in Greek because, like Polybius later, he realized that Greek people were probably the only ones who cared to read it closely. Livy wrote in Latin, the language of the Romans, at a time when Roman society was in desperate need of unification, following the multiple civil wars that had split the nation. Augustus wanted to encourage an environment where writers felt free to be unbiased and unafraid to tell the truth. But one wonders if Livy's differences in Barbatus's history weren't to gain some favor by downplaying the achievements of the paterfamilias, one of Augustus's rivals, as Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony, was a descendant of Barbatus's, and she had commanded an army against Augustus. She could also be credited with helping Romans find the clitoris, as Atlantica seems to show up first in written Latin on projectiles that were used against her in battle. A more plausible reason for the discrepancy is that we are missing a large chunk of Livy's history, which would have covered the events in Barbatus's epitaph. Only books 1 through 10, covering the period from 753 to 293 BCE, and books 21 to 45, covering the period from 219 to 166 BCE, have survived to our time. Livy's account of Barbatus's history is as follows. In 298, following the interreges of Appius Claudius Caecus and Publius Sulpicius, Barbatus and Gnaeus Fulvius are elected consuls, both for the first time. The Third Samnite War is being waged, and the Lucanians, a neighboring people, are attacked by the Samnites. In response, they appeal to Rome for aid and protection, which is granted. This could explain the subduing the whole of Lucania, which shows up on Barbatus's epitaph. Drawing lots for fields of command, Barbatus gets Etruria, and Fulvius gets Samnium, where Turasia and Cassana actually are. Following a battle near Volterrae, Barbatus claims a victory over the Etruscans after recording heavy losses and the Etruscans retreating in the night. The next year, Barbatus, serving at Tifernum as a legate, leads the Hastati, who are spearmen, in a withdrawal and flanking attack, taking his men behind the enemy line via a mountain path. Appearing behind the Samnite army, his men are mistaken for a second army, which spooks the Samnites, leading to a victory for Rome. In 296, Barbatus is not mentioned, but it is presumed he is serving in the army commanded by Maximus, not the one from the Gladiator, which is dealing with uprisings in Lucania, and they fail at defending against Samnite raids. In 295, Barbatus, as propraetor of the Second Legion, sees an army of Senonian Gauls approaching near Clusium, and in an effort to make battle with his insufficient numbers, is surrounded and potentially destroyed. Alternatively, he attempts to save a unit of foragers and defeats an Umbrian army. Livy is unsure on this point. At the Battle of Sentinum, the largest battle in the history to that date, at least according to Roman sources, Barbatus, leading a unit of reserves on the left wing, breaks the Gallic attackers by using previously thrown javelins in a projectile attack. After the Samnites on the right wing retreat, the Gauls are surrounded and defeated by Rome. We don't hear about Barbatus again until 293 at the Siege of Aquilonia. There is some drama regarding the taking of the auspices. Apparently, the sacred chickens, which accompanied Roman armies, refused to eat. This is a bad omen. Their keepers concealed the truth and told the commanders the omens were favorable instead. After this lie is uncovered, the keepers were then forced to serve on the front line in the coming battle. Their punishment showing why you never fucked with the sacred chickens, who are honestly my favorite part of any Roman story. Back to Aquilonia, Barbatus is commanding the left wing of the assault and has to deal with stiff resistance. He chirps his men asking if they are prepared to be late entering the town when the other wing has already had success, and then proceeds to lead the way to the gate as part of a testudo, which is a type of shield formation that looks like a tortoiseshell, and they break into the town. He is lauded for appearing very cheerful in action, whether because of his natural temperament or his expectation of success, as he had already promised the god Jupiter, the victor, a cup of wine and honey if he routed the enemy legions. And that is where Livy's history cuts out. From another source, we know that Barbatus would serve as censor in 280, so it's possible that his actions at Cassana and Teresia occurred after 293. This seems most likely since Barbatus is finally in the right part of Italy, and the third and final Samnite War will continue for another 3 years, ending in 290, which is after the part where Livy's history cuts out on us. And with that, we have now reached the end of Barbatus's epitaph. What a standard he has set for future members of his family to follow. He has earned a nickname, he's been a successful politician, and he's had daring military victories. His two sons, Lucius Cornelius Scipio and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Asina, will both achieve the consular rank, and their sons, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, Publius Cornelius Scipio, and Publius Cornelius Scipio Asina, thank the gods one of them inherited the nickname Ass, commemorating his father's military blunder, will also reach the consular rank, and we'll take a look at their careers in the next episode. Until then, thank you for stopping by and climbing the Cursus Scipionum with us. Ciao!